Welcome to the Recombination Nation podcast. Today I have a guest which I struggle to round up in a neat little 20-word description. Stetson from Holodoxa is a writer on Substack who I have been following for quite some time, and he covers such a breadth and depth of topics that it's almost difficult to keep up. But there's always something interesting coming down the line. So I would highly recommend you check out his Substack and considering subscribing. He variously touches on human evolution, modern medicine and genetic science, literature and culture and AI, and there's probably a dozen things that I can't pull off the top of my head there. But to give a more thorough introduction about who you are, because this is something I'm learning as well through this opportunity to talk to you, do you want to tell us a bit more about who you are and how you came to be interested in so many different topics, which I also find interesting?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for the invite on the show. I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. And my background is mostly genetics. I come from a medical genetics or clinical genetics. Those are that are interchangeable mostly background. And I did thesis research on a gene called PTEN, which is a tumor suppressor gene, where germline mutations in the gene associate with both risk for hereditary cancers as well as neurodevelopmental conditions like autism. And I've always had an interest in a wide range of topics besides just genetics, but genetics has kind of been the core of my intellectual interests. And from there, I kind of go everywhere. And in some respects, I wish I could keep it to a main theme in some way, shape, or form. I think that really does well when you're writing on the internet that someone can put a tag on you and understand exactly what your niche is. I don't have that yet. Maybe I'll find it someday. So right now I just kind of explore in maybe not the most focused way. Whatever comes across my desk or my mind, I read voraciously, and it's kind of whatever I'm reading at the time is really guiding or directing whatever I'm thinking about at that time.
Yeah, yeah. And audience capture is real. And I mean, it kind of works if you pander, but then you kind of become a creation of the audience, which comes at a cost. Um,
Indeed.
Now, I'll start with a general question because probably the most dramatic thing that's happened in recent history is this absolute flood of genetic data. And I'm old enough to remember living through the publication of the first human genome and watching that very momentous occasion and then a kind of collective shrug afterwards, like all of the things that were promised in that era
Hmm.
kind of some happened, but many just kind of, oh yeah, we never really talked about that. Um, and I'm reminded of the story of the drunk who is looking for his missing car keys under the streetlight because that's not where he dropped them, but that's where the light is. And I wonder if there's a similar issue in the dynamic of genetics as a broad field, that we have so much data that we feel like there must be all of these things that we can do with it. But there's lots of other forms of information that could be more relevant to certain problems, but it's difficult to actually gather and even more difficult to analyze than, just running another set of algorithms over the genomes that you've put in a pile. So, do you think that might be kind of a summary of the moment that we're in?
Yes, I think that captures an important truth. We're very limited just in science generally by the methods that are available to us, what we can measure. And for genomics and genetics, that's very much the truth as well. The hubris at the time when the Genome Project was wrapping up, or even in the run up to the Genome projects wrapping up, was that there'd kind of be like a one gene, one disease, or one trait sort of relationship. And there are those things that exist in the genome that fit that Mendelian or monogenic model. But and it's a sizable number of genes and it affects a sizable portion of the population.
Mm.
But a lot of the traits that we really care about or that are really socially relevant, they're complex traits and they're affected by thousands, millions of changes in the genome, and it's really a much bigger task than we initially thought it was when 20 years ago when that project was wrapping up.
And one of the common approaches seems to be, oh, we just need more data. If a million
Yeah.
genomes isn't enough, then we just need to sequence everybody and every cell in
Yes.
everybody.
Yeah, yeah, and in some respects, though, in genomics, that is something that is extremely important when it
Mm,
comes to genome-wide association studies, and the effect of one tiny change is infinitesimally small, like
mm,
we call it the infinitesimal model in genetics, which goes back to Ronald Fisher back in the early 20th century, and we know that in order to detect these effects reliably, you have to get sometimes millions of participants in your studies. And so fortunately, sequencing genomes became very inexpensive over time. And now by the end of the 2010s into the early 2020s, we have built enormous data sets, which are some of the phenotyping needs to keep up. We did a good job of genotyping people, and now we need to do a little bit better job of getting really granular about phenotypes. Because we
mhm,
have the easy ones to measure, like how tall are you? How long did you go to school for? And like some of these things are what color are your eyes? What color is your skin? What color is your hair? These sorts of like really easy traits to have phenotype information on. We have for lots and lots of people, but some of the more sophisticated phenotypes or more detailed phenotypes we don't necessarily have yet.
mm.
And so those will hopefully come too. So yes, it is in some respects gathering data is really important, and it seems like we have so much, we should be able to get more out of it. And there's some of that too. We could be a little bit more creative about the data we have, and there are a lot of people out there that are doing that. But in some respects too, we still need to collect more data too. And yeah, and there's some populations too that are just they aren't sampled as well. And there's a lot of diversity in our genome, even though we're a young species and we haven't captured all of it yet. So
Mm.
there's more out there to learn too, even about existing populations.
What do you think is the dark matter of biology? Like, what are the things that are, off the edge of the map that we kind of have a sense there's something there, but we don't
Mhm.
have tools that can be applied as
Mhm. Mhm.
enthusiastically as DNA sequencing that has been in the last like 20 years?
Yeah. From a genetics perspective, there are kind of two big things. One is, what are the functional changes or the functional effects of every possible change in the genome? There's roughly 3 billion base pairs in a haploid genome of a human, and each one of those base pairs can be changed to one of four different bases, which we abbreviate as A, T, C, and G. And in addition to that, that information can be rearranged or deleted or duplicated. There are a lot of different things can happen to it as well. And we don't necessarily know the impact of all of these possible changes. But theoretically, in the population, the big population we have, almost every conceivable type of genetic variation exists somewhere out there,
Yeah,
possibly, at
yeah.
least to our existing genome out there in the population in a lot of ways. So we need to understand what the functional consequences of variants out there. That's a huge problem in clinical and medical genetics. If you look at when we run tests, looking to provide a medical diagnosis or to look if there is a risk for someone being a carrier of a genetic disease, if they were to pass on, both from a mother and a father to their offspring, then we need to have a good handle on what the effects are going to be. And so for the most part, when we run these tests, like 50 to 75% of the time, the variants we find, we can't provide a definitive classification. Like this is not causing disease, in which case we call it benign, or this is causing disease, and we call that pathogenic.
Mm.
And so we call that the problem of variants of uncertain significance or variants of unknown significance, which I wrote about recently on Substack in a very accessible way, hopefully. And that is a huge problem that's relevant that I think about all the time. But there are also other kind of major questions too in genetics, like what does the non-coding genome do? A lot of times you'll hear like conversations about, oh, only 1 to 2% of the genome codes for proteins, and like we talk about biological function. When we talk about it, it's all about proteins.
Yeah.
So the question is what does all the rest of the genome do? We know a little bit about it, but there's a lot that we don't know
And
that's
a lot of
happening
it's
in the
very
non-coding
highly
genome.
conserved as well. Like there's parts of
Yes.
the non-coding genome that are much more highly conserved than any protein. And we're like,
Yeah.
what do they do?
Yes, yeah, and they're parts of the non-coding genome that are very distinct in humans
Mm,
versus even our versus other archaic humans or versus our other nearest ancestors like chimpanzees, for instance. And so those are of huge interest. Like these regions are different between, you know, us and our nearest relatives that don't quite have the same capabilities and traits that we have. And so, wow, those must be really important to making us who we are.
mm.
So we
Uh,
don't know yet.
What do you think about the issue of higher level genetic structure? So, I've seen
Mm,
some really interesting studies about how the chromosomes are arranged when the cell is
mm,
actually transcribing, and often the genes
mm,
on different chromosomes end up near each other. So,
mm, mm.
have you seen or looked into much work on, like, there's no simple technique for measuring any of that, as far as I can tell. So, we kind of know it's there, but we
Yeah.
don't know how to measure it on a scale to actually analyze it and understand what's happening.
Yes, the typical approach there is like chromatin capture is the phraseology that's often used. And so they'll put a chemical in that will cross-link the DNA and the chromatin together. And then they'll, get rid of all the extra stuff, save the DNA that's left over, and then sequence the DNA that's there. And then what they get back, they'll say like, oh, these pieces of DNA were associated with each other, and these pieces of DNA, one's from like chromosome 1 and one's from chromosome 10. Like, so somehow they're getting close to each other. And so there's like a regulatory relationship here. And so, yeah, we have tons of this data. There's different ways to approach it and different ways to study it and so on. It's really important because ultimately, like in the kind of the biology 101 is like the reason cells adopt the identity that they have is because they've arranged their genomes in a particular way to express certain gene programs so that they adopt a certain cellular phenotype.
Mm.
It goes to the basis of like why is this a skin cell versus this being a neuron and so on. And so there's tons of these experiments. I'm not an expert in this literature. I've read some of these papers before. I'm familiar with some of these figures. They're really opaque figures to try to understand. They're like these like heat map triangles, and they're like, this is the topologically associated domain. Like you hear that phrase in these papers a lot. And so I'm losing your question, but
Mm.
I mean, it's a really important approach. It's just that I think we don't necessarily have like a great understanding of how to turn that data into things that are like informing sort of applications.
Well,
Like
to take that further, if
yeah.
CRISPR lived up to the hype and was reliable and on target enough to use in humans, or any
Mhm.
other species that, if you want, but do we actually understand enough about how whole genomes work to make changes reliably? Like if we want a particular outcome, are we at the stage? Or, I mean, you look at the way like crop genetic engineering is, they just throw the
Mhm.
genes in all over the genome and then
Yes.
phenotypically select the ones
Yeah.
that produce the
Screen.
trait they're
Yeah.
looking for.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that's probably more efficient. The functional screen. It's like a spray and pray, sort of this the trial and error method.
Mm,
Yeah, and I think for human, yeah, you can't unfortunately ethically you can't do that in like a living human, of course, or a soon to be living human. And yeah, so that's an important constraint is like it's related to the problem of uncertain significance because we don't know a lot of what a change to the genome actually does. We it wouldn't be proper or ethical to go in and try to change it a bunch and then see what happens, even though that's what one would have to scientifically do to find out. There's other ways to approach that question, but they're not necessarily as definitive as just doing that.
mm,
So, but that's not to detract from the fact that we still do know a lot about the effect of certain variants, but most of those are related to this is a mutation that causes a specific disease, and it's usually a rare disease that affects like a small number of people. There are certain exceptions to this, like the ApoE allele, like we know, like ApoE4 allele will raise one's risk for Alzheimer's over their lifetime. If
Mm,
if they're a homozygote, for example, it's a real a significant bump, but that's a real kind of exception where it's a kind of a common variant that actually has a significant impact on a phenotype.
mm,
Usually, those common variants have a very small impact on the phenotype. There's a trade-off between the frequency of a variant and its impact, typically.
mm,
And so there are a lot of rare variants that we do know. And so if we were to say find them in an embryo that was going to be implanted in a expectant mother, we could use CRISPR to correct that mistake, and it would theoretically entirely cure that individual of the disease. And there are some situations in which we've sort of done that. There was an infant born recently who had a inborn error in metabolism, and they were able to correct that inborn error in metabolism with a CRISPR approach
mm,
in the living infant, and they were able to do this in 7 months after the birth, because they do the heel stick in the newborn, they get the diagnosis just from the metabolic profile, they confirm it with genetic sequencing, and then they just immediately started on the genetic engineering project that then was successful. They administered two treatments, and right now, the baby was able to leave the hospital, and it seems to have improved in their condition. And then we'll, continue to follow up on that story, but it seems to be the first ever in vivo genetic editing that was ever done in humans, and
mm.
seems to have been a success.
Interesting. Yeah, things are
Yeah.
definitely progressing and it's amazing to watch. A related question, some of the most common genetic diseases like thalassemias or sickle cell became as common as they have in the human populations because they
Mhm.
confer advantages when you are a heterozygote and you've only got one
Yeah.
copy of that unusual variant of the gene.
Yes.
Um, do you suspect that other
Heterozygous advantage cases.
yeah, yeah. Do you think there's
Yeah.
other conditions like that where the
Yes.
benefit hasn't been identified, but it might be something surprising? I mean, in like the Jewish
Yes. Yeah.
community with the link between Tay-Sachs type disorders and
Yeah.
neurological impact is one that's quite different. Are there likely to be others of these hiding around the world that we haven't quite figured out what that variant gene is doing that's a
Yes.
benefit
Yeah.
as well as a trade-off that you have some negative effects as well?
Yeah, there's certainly other cases of heterozygote advantage out there that exist. There's one emerging one that has some early evidence for, and that's cystic fibrosis. The most common allele that causes cystic fibrosis, if you have two of them, is this deletion of a single amino acid, this deletion of a single phenylalanine at the 508th position. And so it's a very common allele. And it explains a significant portion of the cystic fibrosis cases. And it's more common in European populations. And the idea behind the heterozygote advantage is that in which we just discovered, thanks to these kind of population-based, genome-wide association type studies, is that it is associated with the reduced incidence of irritable bowel syndrome.
Hmm.
And the question is like, okay, so that irritable bowel syndrome, that's this kind of like a modern phenotype. So the question is like, why is sort of pulling back that chloride channel activity, because it's a chloride channel gene, the cystic fibrosis gene, why pulling back a little bit on that chloride channel function, why does that improve, say, gut function in some ancestral environment? And so we don't have the answer for that, whereas we do for thalassemias or we
Hmm.
do for sickle cell anemia, for example. We know that that was selected for because it provides some measure of protection against malarial infections. And so that's why it's, more common in populations from the Mediterranean, more common from populations from Africa. So
Hmm.
the question is why in the more ancient European environment, was there a need to kind of change or tune gut function in some way, shape, or form? We don't know yet, but that seems like a good plausible example of a case of heterozygous advantage.
Hmm. Yeah, I've
that
seen
a lot of people
speculation
don't
it's
talk
linked
about.
to diarrhea type diseases, which kill a lot of
Sure.
children. Yeah, so it used to be a major
Yeah.
source of death.
Right. And so that could link into to dairying as well. So I
Mm,
mean, maybe it's arguably related to the emergence of lactase persistence as well. Whereas, we know that people who are lactose intolerant, they tend to have uh, bad gastrointestinal responses to consuming dairy. But if that's the only calories around, which it seems to be, at least in some cases in the ancestral environment, that was the people who were able to reactivate the galactosidase expression, were able to get more calories and were able to be more robust, more fit, and
mm.
had more offspring.
I mean, it makes me, it's that kind of evolution feels like a kind of slap together short-term solution to a really pressing problem, like malaria
Mhm.
suddenly becoming so
Mhm.
prevalent as population densities rise that any way that you can get past it to reproduce is good enough. But then
Mhm.
there's population level genetics that start causing problems when the gene becomes too common, and you end up in this
Mhm. Mhm.
kind of equilibrium state between people with no protective genes dying of malaria and with too many protective genes dying of sickle cell or thalassemias. And
Right, right.
are there, I'm trying to think, are there any more ancient kind of biological systems that function like that, where only the heterozygotes? I'm sure there'd be some if you dig around in biology. I mean, it comes down to how expensive those homozygotes are with like too many or too few copies of the gene. Or
Right.
ultimately, if you can come up with a genetic solution that doesn't only work when you only have one copy of the gene, maybe
Mhm.
in time that becomes the dominant solution.
Yep. Yep.
Mm, mm,
Yeah, no, yeah, it's kind of tough. It's one of these, it seems like one of these cases where like you're relying, you're relying on the pleiotropy to like solve your solution, and it's going to come at a cost, but you're like, okay, this cost is okay to bear, provided, it doesn't get too common. So, and which I mean, like in some cases, like the fact that you're going to have homozygote offspring that are, even if say it was embryonic lethal, for example, which there may be cases of that,
mm,
that might be harder to detect because you won't ever see the disease. The children won't exist. Then it ultimately won't have that big of a fitness impact because you can just keep having hets, and as long as like it's not always hets mating with other hets, it's a potentially a place that can reach like a homeostasis
mm, mm,
at the population.
mm,
And then of course, like over time, like how long will the problem be? Like, obviously the selection pressure from malaria is like a lot less today than it was in the past. And the starvation selection that led to the, lactase persistence evolution, that selection pressure, the intensity of it is gone now, for example. So it's like, and then you can go and meet a population that wasn't subject to the selection pressure, and then you're outbreeding, and then the allele frequency of that allele is going down, down, down as it's being outbred, and the selection pressure is going away. So
mm.
it's just like, yeah.
Here's a related question, kind of moving on to human evolution, and maybe one that's a bit too spicy, but let's see. So we seem to be at a time in history that is entering a prolonged demographic decline. Population, maybe it'll turn around and equilibrate at some point, but
Mhm.
there's an interesting set of selection pressures that are applying to the population where only some of us are having children, particularly in the Western world, but the pattern is seems to be spreading everywhere.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts about what that selection pressure might do to the
Mhm.
human race collectively in the next centuries if it continues?
So you're basically referring to how in most advanced nations the total fertility rate is below the replacement level, the
Yeah, yeah,
the
and
big
yeah,
2.1
sometimes
one
dramatically
figure.
below. I think South Korea is at
Yes.
zero point 0.7, which is,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, that's halving every probably 15 or so years, which is, I mean, that's worse than almost any other population bottleneck. that we
Yes,
have.
yeah.
Yeah. So I mean,
There's actively shrinking populations, yeah.
mm.
And East Asia, yes, it is.
And
It is
it's
a
not
challenge.
shrinking the
Yeah.
population randomly. Presumably, there's going to be something different about the people who do continue to have children under those conditions.
Yes, yeah, yeah. The emerging thing is that it is, associated with higher religiosity, higher levels of political conservatism. However, that's construed, but that seems pretty consistent across the world,
Mm.
even though that can mean different things in different places. Um,
And
yes, so
religiosity has a fairly well-established connection to certain genetic patterns. And again, it's not a simple one is to one, here's the God gene. It's like a scattergun of millions of tiny influences. So it's not easy to just pin it down.
right, yes, I'm sure there's probably some level of heritability to religiosity, almost certainly, just like all human traits, and then the causal path to get to that is extremely complex.
Mm,
And so, but so yeah, in terms of it's hard to game out in terms of like what is that? Is there actually like a selection, a type of selection that's going on, or what will be the ultimate population consequences? I think that the genetic differences between probably people who are having children, people who don't have children are probably not absolutely enormous.
mm,
So I wouldn't expect like a huge consequence, but I do think there are enormous demographic, political, economic consequences of the crashes in fertility that are occurring places, and that will require, you know, major reorganizations to how governance is done, how economies are done, because there are significant consequences depending on, it's the devil's in the detail, and it'll be different in different places. For example, like in America, where I am, a lot of the times, like we can probably solve some of these issues by just turning on the immigration valve a little bit, and then like even though you're not actually replacing the population with a native population, you are at least maintaining a certain population level because you're able to pull from other places. Of course, this has then negative potential consequences on other places if they're losing a bunch of people potentially, and a lot of times those populations are selected in some way in
mm,
terms of like a lot of times they may be higher educated, or they may have other resources that they're bringing with them when they move, or other capabilities. And so there will be enormous political consequences because of these demographic changes. Whether that is going to be differences genetically, I don't know.
mm,
It's an interesting question. I would guess no. The demographer Lyman Stone always likes, who's also on Substack, always likes to mention how the there's basically like no difference in like the genetic inputs on fertility for the
mm.
most part. Like it's not a trait that varies because it's under strong, strong selection pressure.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
whatever the genetic inputs are on fertility, it's pretty much like stuck at where it is because people have to be able to have children because it's like that's the definition of
Of
evolutionary
fit. Yeah,
fitness.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, a
Yeah.
related question, could you see the widespread adoption of broad trait selection and embryo selection, broad trait screening and embryo selection, making people
Mhm.
more likely to want to have children?
I mean, assuming that you could select for a trait like religiosity or
Oh,
whatever
no, no, I
underneath
would say
that,
other
yeah,
things like health or
yeah.
intelligence or, other things that are broadly valued in society. If you had a higher odds of producing an
Mhm.
exceptional child, whatever your own values are, do you think
Mhm.
that might have a contribution to like reversing or at least slowing or changing the dynamic of the demographic decline that's ahead of us?
Mhm. I mean, I'm very skeptical of that idea just because you have in order to do something like polygenic embryo screening, you have to be someone who's choosing to use an assisted reproductive technology,
Mm,
IVF typically, and or I mean that's the only way you can do it now. And so you have to be someone who's doing that. I think the sum total of like IVF births in a year, it's a small number. It's in the tens of thousands,
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
year over year. And so unless you find something that has a huge, huge impact, which
Mm,
you can't necessarily like rule out, But unless you find that, and that is going to go to fixation, which, evolutionary term means it's going to go from basically 0 to 1 and it's going to do it quickly.
Mm.
Unless you find that sort of rare case, I don't think it's going to have a huge effect on the population. Unless they're their children and their children, and eventually you find it because generation after generation, everyone's doing this selection or and engineering on top of that potentially. Like eventually, maybe if that's the process, then it's going to have an effect. But we're talking like again, evolutionary timelines are often very long, and this one might shorten it a little bit if
Yeah.
you're doing a lot of this and you know what you're doing, but it's still it's still going to take time in a lot of cases, unless it's like something extremely interesting, which
Mm.
is going to
Do,
be unlikely.
do you think the potential, at least at this stage of polygenetic embryo selection, is being oversold? That the people who are developing it and promoting it are probably maybe tipping the scale a little bit to the benefits versus, the inconvenience and the cost and the risks of the medical procedures that go along with it?
I think it really depends on what the expectations are of the consumer.
Mm.
If they're looking to want to screen out risk for single gene conditions, that you
Mm.
can do that extremely effectively.
Yeah.
If they want the polygenic score that they're selecting on to guarantee them like what's being predicted, it might not come out that way.
Yeah.
But a lot of what's being communicated about this process is that, it's probabilistic. These, scores are predictions. There's no guarantee. These traits, even if they are highly heritable, there's still input from there's
Yeah.
other sources of
Yeah,
variation on the
it's
trait.
very difficult to
Yeah,
like go back to the lab and say, "Here's my kid at 10. They turned
yes,
out this way. It's your fault." Like
right.
it's a very nebulous
Yeah.
product that they're offering.
Yes. What if they had a traumatic brain injury, or what if, there's any number of things that could happen
Mm.
that could interfere with what this polygenic score is predicting. And then there's tons of debates about, whether polygenic scores are actually predicting based on causative genetic variation or just variation that's been tagged. And those the tagging of causal variation, it may also be a function of other confounding factors.
Yeah.
There's papers about like this where they do studies to show like, oh, this portion of the polygenic risk score is explained by these confounding factors,
Mm.
and it's not like direct genetic causation. It's something else that's explaining that association. So there's those issues as well. Now there's advances all the time, so it
Mm.
will get better. It will continue to get better. For instance, I think there was I think Mass General, I think just or someone, an expert, a cardiovascular disease expert there recently just launched a polygenic risk score test for cardiovascular disease risk that it depends wholly on polygenic markers or, so the SNP markers. And so, this is coming to the clinic. It's going to be here. It's not going to go away. It's going to get better. So it is going to be a feature of our medical technology and our culture. But yeah, it's kind of very much at the margins now, and it doesn't necessarily people shouldn't believe like extreme claims. There's a
Mm.
lot of caveats and there's a lot of complexity involved.
Do you think if the technology improves and strengthens and like lives up to its promises, that the human race could end up in something like a runaway selection process, like end up with peacock's tails that we're dragging around because people 200 years ago thought that trait at its extreme was desirable?
Um, I don't think we can expect like science fiction level variation in phenotypes, if that makes sense. There's this really great book by uh I think he's a theoretical physicist, but he works on scaling laws.
Mm.
And there's like a subfield of like scaling laws, which is kind of a mathematical thing where he studies allometry, which is basically like the study of like how biological organisms scale.
Mm.
So like he has a passage in this book. The book is called Scale by Jeffrey West. He's like at the Santa Fe Institute. And he, goes through as like, why you can't have Godzilla, these sorts of
Yeah, yeah,
very
yeah.
popular
He'd
popular
crumple
science
under
like
his own
debunking.
weight. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, things like that. So because of these kind of very basic biological constraints that exist
Mm.
in our system, in our metabolism,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
in our body plan and things like this, the possibility space that exists for natural selection to do its amazing things um, is limited in meaningful ways.
It's like you
Especially,
couldn't just
yeah.
graft a set of wings onto a human. They wouldn't be capable of the metabolic output to actually get airborne, no matter how big the wings are.
Right, right. Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And these sorts of constraints that exist in the evolutionary landscape. A lot of times these are sources of skepticism about like evolution.
Mm.
But because people are saying like, how do you get to like this level of complexity? I mean, it's a common thing when we talk about the evolution of language. People say like, what good is half a grammar? Or what good is partial language? It's like no good. It's got to come in fully formed, and then that's what's going to provide an advantage. And like true, it's like there are some hurdles to imagining how to get to a certain trait, but a lot of times when there's a really close study of these things, you can see how things facilitate themselves. Uh, and there's many examples of this. But you know,
Well, we can explore human evolution because I think that's a
yeah,
very salient example of an organism that got around metabolic limits in a
yeah,
couple of unexpected ways. Do you
yes, yeah.
what's your opinion on that? Like, what's really odd metabolically about humans?
Well, of course, the shortcuts is something that obviously jumps out. When how do you have such a short gut and such a big brain? Obviously, you need to be consuming a lot of calories, and the calories have to be easy to digest. And so we've offloaded a lot of our metabolic work that we would need to do to get calories into our body off on cooking, which is essentially just a cultural technology or just a technology. And we're extremely dependent on that. And I think humans came into being, our modern lineage came into being already dependent on cooking. It's something that came about somewhere in the hominid lineage, a long, long time ago, probably, maybe even as long as 2 million years ago.
Mm,
Um, when some a species like Homo erectus was taming fire, and instead of just eating raw meat from hunts that they were successful on, they decided to start smoking meats or start actually cooking meats, and it started exploding the amount of calories that were available to them. And that really is thought to enable the runaway brain growth that happened over the 2 million year period that leads up to us.
mm,
There was a tripling in brain size. Of course, it was already kind of starting even as of 2 million years ago, but it was a really fast gradient when you look at the sampling of the skull sizes. You're really getting massive, massive, really fast brain growth over this period of time.
mm.
And that's obviously enormous grist for evolutionary theorizing and evolutionary debates. But cooking
Another
was, of course, important.
Another
Yeah, sorry.
big limit over brain size in chimps was heat loss,
Yes,
heat
yes, yeah,
dispersal, and humans have
yes,
radically changed our we're kind of like a water cooled PC that you can like
yes,
overclock it without it catching fire. Um,
yes, yes.
and one possible explanation for this is I have a real fondness for this theory. And I'm clear that we want to talk about this, and it's quite controversial, the pig chimp hybrid hypothesis. And
Yes,
I
yeah.
wonder if you've looked into it and what your perspective on it is.
I haven't done like a deep dive on the pig chimp hybrid hypothesis. Um, and admittedly, I'm not like someone who wants to like quash all like extremely out there ideas in science. I think
Mm,
it's perfectly fine to debate and discuss and give crazy ideas hearings sometimes. But just based on what we know about the genetics of of ancient humans, of the whole hominid line and chimpanzees and what we can know about common ancestor. I mean, the gene, everyone hears this all the time about how similar chimp genomes and human genomes are. They
Mm.
always say like, oh, it's 99 point, 4% similar, which is actually it can be misleading. It depends on like how, exactly what we mean by these things. But the point is that, if you look at any random chimp gene and you look at any random human gene, the differences between them are going to be very minuscule. They're going to
Yep.
look like the same gene. And so, just based on these genetic analyses, we know that as of, pretty recently, evolutionary speaking, like 7 million years ago, we're sharing a common ancestor, and one evolutionary lineage went on to chimps, and one went on to all the other humans, and then eventually to us. And so there's there's really no room in there to recombine with the pig genome. And one of the big ways to think about that is if you just look at the simply at the chromosome numbers.
Hmm.
So like if you look at a chimp species or really any other primate species, they all have 48 total chromosomes, and humans have 46.
Mm.
And so the typical story about how we get from 48 to 46 is that there's a fusion event. And so you go from two to one chromosome
Mm.
in the haploid genome, and then you've gone from 24 to 23, and then you go from 48 to 46 when they combine when gametes combine. So that solves that problem pretty simple. Pigs have like 38 chromosomes or something, so it's it just doesn't work.
Well, a related question,
Yeah.
how did the ancestors that went through that fusion event found a
Uh,
new species if
yeah.
differencing chromosome numbers makes
Yes.
different organisms completely incompatible? Like you'd have one
Yeah.
animal that had the first mutation,
Right.
wouldn't they have been a dead end? Like, how do you get through that transition as a whole population?
Right. Yeah. There's that, when you go to these 101 biology courses, you always hear about, what is it? The mule and what's the cross? Yeah,
Yeah, donkey and horse, yeah.
donkey and horse. You get a mule, and the mule is entirely sterile, right? So
Mm,
that you're like, okay, given that example, like how could you ever go from a situation where there's gametes that are 24 chromosomes and gametes with 23 chromosomes floating around, and how is that something where people are actually going to be able to have children when the hybrid occurs,
mm,
right? And someone has 47 chromosomes. What's going on there? Well, there's any number of things. It's like, say the fusion event, for whatever reason, it's very common and it keeps happening, happening, happening for any period of time. And so there's a population of these individuals that specifically make these 23 gametes, and they're the ones that just get together with each other. And then their offspring just have 46 chromosomes. So
mhm.
that's one explanation. The level of skepticism you have there is that how common is this chromosome event, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
other explanation is you just have it happen one time and it's in a male, and it's going to be an extremely reproductively successful male that is separate. So the event happens and this male is with, you know, a group of women, and he's just extremely successful in his isolated place with all these women. And then all of his offspring, you know, go on and on and on. And then you can, at that point in time, have that other previous explanation where maybe there's sorting on the specific 23 gametes, which would just happen if there is some sort of reproductive barrier when you don't have the matched gametes.
Mm,
So
mm.
those are the possible explanations. And this, of course, also can account for why there's a reduced amount of genetic diversity in the human population, because if
Yeah,
we're descending from this, there's a huge, huge bottleneck event
yeah,
that's occurring
yeah.
in our common ancestor where this occurs. So it's a neat explanation in that respect. And it's certainly based on all the evidence when we compare the chromosomes that are proposed to have fused and our current chromosome 2, it looks like that's exactly what happened. So I
Yeah.
think that seems to be the case. Yeah.
On the issue, oh, excuse me, on the issue of metabolic changes
Mhm.
triggering a cascade of like more profound changes in the rest of the organism,
Mhm.
should we be expecting animals that live with us that are now eating cooked food to start making a similar transition, or at least freeing
Mhm.
up new possibilities in evolution? And I would maybe
Mhm.
bring up the parallels between humans massively increasing our amylase copy number as we became farmers, And
Mm,
dogs
mm,
during domestication have gone through the exact same change.
mm,
So
mm,
are we potentially? I mean, I kind of think of like the trilobites were the first organisms that figured out how to make armor and slicing jaws and segmented legs, and they
mm.
ruled the roost for quite a long time. But they induced lots of other parallel lineages to undergo pretty much the same change and eventually outpace them. Are
Mhm,
we
mhm.
are we just like the first trilobites of sentience?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that kind of goes into with the whole self domestication thesis too. Obviously, the animals that live with us and eat cooked food typically are domesticated animals as well. And so, yeah, I think there is probably a parallel, or you could say maybe to some extent convergent evolution on some of those metabolic phenotypes. For instance, the amylase duplications that you're talking about in the human and dog genomes. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of all wrapped up in the same sort of process of self-domestication, in which, cooking is the technology that's figuring prominently in there. I would imagine that because it's happening in us first, it's probably stronger.
Mm.
And I don't necessarily know like exactly what the consequences or what to predict the consequences would be for cats and dogs or any other domesticated species that we're feeding cooked foods to. So it's it's hard to really game out. But
We do have one really example of a founder effect. The ancestor of all collie dogs was just
Mm,
one extremely intelligent female dog that was like
mm,
miles above her other species in her population at the time. And yeah, she had so many puppies that then had so many puppies, and the trait managed to stick. And like, yeah, collie type dogs have an unusually high level of intelligence compared to other breeds these days. So I mean, we've seen it
yeah.
happen in history.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly like a lot of these things, and I imagine, I know there's certainly a number of experts in like dog genetics out there, and there is like I don't know how strong the industry is, but there is an industry for people who actually clone their dogs,
Hmm.
and so and some of them obviously test their dogs, obviously with these extreme artificial breeding schemes as well that go on. These also create genetic issues for some of these breeds as well. And so there's certainly like a lot of things there. I'm not very well read in the dog genome literature, but there's probably a lot of really interesting things that there may be some lessons for just selective breeding in general from some of these experiments that I don't know if they've been entirely explored.
Mm.
It's like maybe we have a tendency to overlook kind of these man's best friend.
Oh, well, getting back to humans, I mean,
Uh,
genetic technology has recently exposed a much more of a braided river kind of history
yes,
for our species rather than just a simple branching tree
yes,
where
yeah,
lineages just get pruned off. I think I've
yes.
seen an analysis that there's probably more Neanderthal DNA alive in humans today than there ever was when they were just pure Neanderthals. And I mean, it brings up a couple of
True. Well,
interesting
yes.
questions, like even discounting extremely wide and extremely rare hybridization like pig chimp, it seems that hybridization is much more important for evolution and speciation than we recently appreciated. And I wonder if you are picking up on any threads of genetic analysis kind of adapting to that new reality now that it's becoming more acceptable and the data is like right there in many cases.
Yes, yeah, for sure. For sure. I think hybridization is an extremely important sort of evolutionary process, and just an important thing that natural selection takes advantage of. There's the famous example of Denisovans having altitude adaptation, and then there being Denisovan, the technical term being introgression, but basically interbreeding with modern human lineages, which then came into those same areas, like in the Southeast Asia, like Nepal and the Himalayas and so on. And just immediately that height and altitude adaptation going right into the modern human lineage
Mm.
and jumping to fixation in the humans that continue to live in those regions. So there's these famous examples of that are illustrative of exactly how important those sort of mixtures of genetically distant populations, when they recombine eventually, how important that can be for evolution. And this is speculated to be, I mean, there's some evidence for this as well, for basically where did modern humans come from? And there's proposed to be these very generically named stem lineages of stem B and stem A that were, initially sharing an ancestor that separated for a time somewhere in ancient Africa, and then that they recombined, somewhere along around the time where we put the modern emergence of our lineage, which is like around 300,000 years ago, somewhere in
Mm.
Southeast or Eastern Africa. And that recombination event of those two stem lineages resulted in our modern lineages and
Yep.
led to all the behavioral modernity that we have. So that's the big hybridization event that's proposed that lead to us. And of course, just across like the animal kingdom, hybridization events can be extremely important because you're pulling together, you know, lineages that have been separated, have gone through their own selection pressure, selection processes, and then put them back together. Sometimes it leads to something magical, sometimes it leads to a complete dead end.
Mm.
And sometimes just because you're putting up a bit of a reproductive barrier, maybe in some cases that those certain combinations are create reproductive barriers. For instance, it's thought that modern humans and Neanderthals mating, that the males of those events were infertile or like pretty infertile.
Mm.
And they show this by showing selection on X chromosomes because the males hybrids in this case only have one X chromosome, and you can show the depletion of the Neanderthal portions in the X chromosome over
Mm.
time
Mm.
in these ancient genomes. And so that's just an example of where we had a mixture event, you have a reproductive barrier, but then, you get the modern human lineage in part, like, where we have some Neanderthal genes hanging out at a relatively high, it's not that high, it's like 1 to 4 frequencies in modern populations and contributing to phenotypes. I mean, there's not in huge ways, but there was that work on how certain segments of the Neanderthal genome created risk factors for severity of COVID infection recently. And
Mhm.
so there's probably some amount of selection on immune phenotypes. I
Mm.
mean, that's a huge, huge part of the human evolutionary history is how did we co-evolve with the pathogen load that was existing, you know, over time.
Well, I have a couple of related questions to follow on. Um, for an animal our size and of our population density, we're probably one of the most narrowly genetically bottlenecked species that we've ever recorded. Despite we have a lot of diversity, but we also have really deep rooted
Mhm.
bottleneck similarities as
Yes.
well.
Yeah.
And I have a kind of theory floating around that if you look at
Mhm.
living fossils,
Mhm.
organisms that have remained relatively unchanged for very long periods of time, they're
Mhm.
often they're like the only species in that family. They have no
Mhm.
near relatives that are distinctly different from them. And I wonder
Mhm.
if that is a kind of evolutionary dead end because they lose the capacity to hybridize
Mhm.
with related populations. They become isolated. And
Mhm.
could
Mhm.
that be a fate for humans? Because we've been so narrowly successful that, like, if we keep narrowing our genetics, particularly like if we use embryo selection to all end up looking like, the exact same 7 foot tall, 160 IQ Olympic athlete, maybe there's only so many ways you can like scramble the genes to get that one
Uh,
thing. Are we in danger of like becoming so perfect that we become inflexible?
right. I think there is some cost when there really is only one type or one main type flooding out there. Um, whether that is an issue for humans is a hard question to really predict what the effects are of that because we have so many other things that kind of sit on top of like our genome alone, where you
Mm,
have all these cultural adaptations or people whatever people will talk about on top of the genome that allows us to do all the amazing things that we're able to do today. Um, so I don't know if it's a big restraint on human possible future human evolution. I think to some extent, some of it is like, this type was the best type for that environment. And if we don't have any radical, dramatic, super dramatic changes in the environment, you that may always be the most fit version of things,
Mm.
and it may be just okay. And maybe you don't see like a huge amount of change, provided there's not a huge amount of environmental change. Now, if there's a fast environmental change, and then there may not be enough genetic diversity floating around to select from, and then it may increase the likelihood of extinction. The thing that's great about humans, even though it's a young species and maybe there's not that much variation, it's such a huge population
Mm.
that, and it's all over the globe, many different climates and environments that, maybe we'll be okay.
Yeah. Well, the complexity of organisms that we seem today seems to be related to the complexity of our reproductive and evolutionary mechanisms. And like sexual reproduction has a lot
Mhm.
of advantages. It allows you to
Yes.
rapidly build up a level of
Yes.
complexity, but it imposes
Yeah.
its own constraints as well. And
Yes.
I wonder if the mechanisms for evolution are themselves perpetually evolving. Like sexual evolution has only been around for part of the history of life on Earth. Before
Mhm.
that, you had,
Mhm.
bacteria doing it a very different way. And
Yes.
part of me wonders if humans, with our technology and our growing awareness of biological mechanisms, could actually be
Mhm.
opening up a whole new way for evolution to take place.
Mhm.
Basically,
Mhm.
horizontal gene transfer, but rather than it being just a scattergun approach, like, oh, you got infected with this, and oh, there's a useful gene, or no, you got a nasty mutation, and goodbye. That we could do
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
in a higher success way through whatever technologies we evolve.
Yeah, there's certainly like real possibilities. I mean, we do like if you scan the scientific literature, there are many of these kind of examples where we're taking things from one species. We'll grow, for instance, we'll take pigs, we'll grow a human organ inside the pig because for whatever reason there is some immune complementarity. Maybe you can put that in the pig chimp hypothesis
It is
column.
in there. It
And
is
then
in there.
yeah, yeah. So they because of some of the immune complementarity between pigs and humans, they grow the organ in there. They have to do a bunch of genetic edits, but they do the genetic edits, and then you can theoretically take that organ and put it in a human being. I think they have done this one time. I
Yeah,
can't remember. I don't know if it was a heart or a kidney. I think it was a kidney. And so it is. There's a proof of concept there, and there are many different potential applications of these sorts of things where we're creating these kind of Frankenstein sort of cross species in different ways, or maybe even creating a new organelle or like
yeah,
leveraging a sort of endosymbiont type
yeah,
of
yeah.
idea. And there's tons of these things that are possible. And I mean, there's so many use cases. It's hard to really know like where one should start, or what would be the most interesting or most powerful. But they're certainly there, and there's certainly a lot of similar things happening already. I mean, you can even take the basic idea in molecular genetics of people doing recombinant gene cloning. It's
Mm,
like the idea of you could just cut out a gene, put it in a vector, and then you can do all sorts of different amazing things with it. You can
mm.
manipulate it in all sorts of ways. So that was a huge foundational advance in molecular biology, and that happened in the 70s. So
I just had a related thought. You know what Frankenstein's biggest problem was as a scientist?
no, what was
It was an n equals one experiment.
He needed to make more
Yeah, yeah,
Frankensteins.
you need like 1,000 of them before you like get the recipe right. Just joking, just joking. Uh, now, getting back to like the history of human evolution, I'm really interested in the power of founder populations because there's so many interesting examples of groups of people that started as a relatively small population, sometimes a hybrid population. A Polynesia is a really good example. I mean, that only happened like in the last 1,000 years of two very different groups coming together and then sailing into the middle of the Pacific Ocean and like beginning a new like, entire civilization from a few hundred people. And like the Amish and the Jewish and like
Yep,
like it
there's
happens
many.
again and again.
Yep,
And
yep, yep.
given how the internet is allowing people to connect with each other in ways that have
Mhm.
never been possible before, and that we have like all of these new tools for like, I'll show you more my genome if you show me yours.
Yes, yeah.
And it's a little bit sci-fi, but I mean,
Yeah, a little bit.
time marches on and things that were once hypothetical become real.
Uh-huh.
Could you
Yeah.
imagine that this kind of thing might happen again in the future, that you get a self-selected founding population trying to head in a different direction, even if it isn't driven by, artificial genes, that it could just
Mm,
be
mm.
based on a really select um, initial founding population where you just get
Yeah.
exactly the right people together.
Yeah, I think we could have new founder events in our future human history. I think they almost certainly will occur. I think we sort of have these things happening all the time. I think the factor that mitigates against sort of a strong founding events happening is that there's still like what's going to be the barrier that keeps people apart, that they're
Yeah,
really going to have to work really hard to keep out basically new entrants. And it doesn't take very many new entrants to really change the gradient of gene flow. The
yeah.
gene flow, it's going to increase it really quickly, even if you have very few new entrants. And so there has to be some really strong barriers. Now, in some cases, there are, like there's, for instance, speaking about the Jewish communities, there's very strong Orthodox Jewish communities that basically, you know, they live all in a city together and it's no one in, no one out. And because they have very strict endogamy norms, they only marry them among each other. And so this kind of you have this it was already a founder population a long time ago, and
Mm,
it kind of stays as a founder population
mm,
throughout time.
yeah,
So I don't know. I mean, it's hard. You have to imagine like what are the social, cultural, because there aren't as many geographical and
yeah,
things
yeah.
that are
You can't
going
just
to
sail into
keep
the middle
the
of the ocean anymore and expect no one to find
yeah.
you.
Yeah, there's people everywhere and people are moving everywhere. It's easy to move and yeah, so there's going to have to be a really strong social and cultural isolation. So
Mm.
you have to imagine what that is, you know. And
And
even like these communities are, like for instance, most of the like non-Orthodox Jewish community in America, for instance, the endogamy norms are much weaker, and so there's pretty much all, they're the next generations are pretty much marrying out of the religion. I mean, they're also not as they're more secular, anyways, for example, and so
mm,
this I think happens to even some extent in the Amish community. I live near some Amish communities actually, so you see them, they do a lot of the house building nearby. So yeah, and they're still connected to regular society.
I think I've seen a very back of the napkin demographic projection for the US. And if the current
Mhm.
trends continue, and the current trends never do continue, but if they did, you'd end up
Yeah.
with a majority Amish population within like 100 years because like they're the only people producing large amounts of children consistently.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Amish and Mormon, and
mm.
yeah,
Oh, I think the Mormons are
yeah, so,
tending to
yeah,
just below
yeah,
replacement fertility. So
yeah.
it's
It's
caught up
coming
with them too.
down.
It's probably going to catch up with the
Yeah,
Amish as well at some point. It's
yeah,
pervasive.
yeah. So it's wild. It's how strong the anti-fertility meme has been
Mm.
in modern times. Oh.
Oh, a fun question. Do you
Mhm,
think that the genetic homogeneity, the bottlenecking of humans, is
mhm,
partly responsible for our ultra sociality? That if you
mhm,
like take a
mhm,
selfish gene perspective, if you
mhm,
have a population where we all share so much of our genetics, is it
mhm,
easier to
mhm.
cooperate with people and not be punished evolutionarily?
Yeah, it's hard to know that without like having the out group as a control group, right? Like
Hmm.
say Neanderthals were still extant as like a kind of a pure Neanderthal population, like what would our interactions be between the mixed modern lineage of and
Are
versus
Neanderthals more
Neanderthal?
racist than Homo
Yeah.
sapiens?
Yeah, it's like I mean I imagine there would be like certainly some strong like in-group dynamics and there'd be like competition to some extent and that would counteract potential cooperation, but like what would it look like? And there's people that argue that or there's some evidence to the fact that like potentially more initial agrarian communities living next to hunter-gatherer communities, they didn't necessarily fight. They weren't necessarily cooperating either, but they weren't necessarily in conflict. So, and I'm sure there were genetic differences between those groups, maybe even differences that were bigger than, the differences that exist between modern populations today, for example.
Hmm.
And so it's hard to predict what the if the homogeneity of modern humans actually influences well, the cooperation that we have. I mean, to some extent, you have to say like, of course, because like even like in groups form like very rapidly. Like families cooperate better than with non-kin, right? So there's the kin effect, of course, and so if there's a kin effect, then there's probably also like a broader in-group effect. So there's probably an effect with a broader cult ethno-linguistic group, and then then the continental group. There's so to some extent, I think there is some degree of that. However, I think over our population history, we've kind of broken out of the kind of the kin first dynamics because we've there's this famous hypothesis from Joseph Henrich, which you're probably familiar with, about the marriage and family program in medieval Europe that really had a strong um, taboo and actual ban on cousin marriages, even very distant cousin marriages. So
Mm.
this breaks up cousonages over time in Europe, and then Europe in response to the breaking up of these kinship institutions, they developed these other cultural practices and other institutions that we know as like liberalism and markets and things like that we have today.
Mm.
And these are our scaled cooperative solutions or adaptations to the fact that we're no longer living in basically extremely large family
Mm.
units. And so I think these adapted practices, I think they're robust in their own ways. Like,
Hmm.
could we imagine like this famous phrase, like, I can imagine the end of the world before I can imagine the end of capitalism, right? So things like that. It's like, well, how would we sort these things out without like having markets, or how would we solve these problems? And so I think in some ways these are pretty robust. And I think even if we somehow dropped a new human species onto the planet, I think there would probably be some tensions,
Mm.
but I think a lot of the solutions that have emerged over time would be pretty good
Mm.
for solving some of those issues.
Um, Next related topic, how much do you think? Well, it's another kind of biological dark matter problem.
Uh-huh.
Pheromones in human social interactions, which have
Hmm.
gone from oh no, we can't find the chemicals, we don't have the organ, it doesn't exist, we're actually an exception to every other mammal, to
Uh-huh.
little by little, there's like little hints coming through that yes, there are probably even pheromonal innovations in humans because we
Hmm.
produce emotional tears, and we have now shown that those tears carry pheromonal influences that like change other people's physiology around us.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that kind of emerging research.
Yeah. So my understanding was always that, we don't have the VNO organ, the
Mm,
vomeronasal receptors
hmm.
for pheromone communication. That doesn't rule out any like chemo uh human to human signaling though. I think there, to some extent there are those things. I think perhaps the familiar example is like women's menstrual cycles syncing when they're
Hmm.
when they're living together. And
Mm,
I think the extent of that phenomenon and exactly how it occurs, I don't think is well described or even understood.
mm,
And so there's certainly probably aspects of like human to human chemo signaling that are not well understood.
mm,
And I think we probably could study these closer. So I think there's something there. With tears, I always understood that as more of like a clear, like physical sort of signal,
yeah, it's an honest
as well
signal
than
that's
than a
hard to
chemo.
fake.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, you're right, you're right. And that's so Steven Pinker has a book that was just published that is concerned with the technical idea of common knowledge,
Mm,
which is like this recursive idea that, I know what you know, and you know what I know, and I know that you know that I know, and so on
yeah.
and so
Yeah.
on, like
Yeah.
in an endless recursive way. And he says that a lot of like our face is particularly good at signaling these things to people.
Mm,
So people always evolutionary talk about like we have sclera, and so you can track people's eyes, and like we, because our faces aren't completely covered in hair, you can see when we blush, and the crying. Like there's these, and also these are signals that are like they're honest signals, like you
Yeah.
were saying.
Yeah.
You can't fake them. They're telling something immediately, and it's completely clear, and everyone knows it that it's
Mm.
happening. Everyone knows that it knows that it's happening as well. So yeah, so there are these many layers of communicative systems, and I think chemicals may play some role, but I do think it's, at least in humans, is less so than say like something like ants for sure.
Well, I
Where
mean, recently a study on babies'
yeah,
tears found that
uh-huh.
they influence male testosterone levels. So it's kind of like chemical warfare. And I
Yeah.
think like ant larvae do something similar. They release a slew of signals that
Mhm.
induce other worker ants to care for them, and that gets
Mhm.
hijacked
Mhm.
by like caterpillars that like feed on the brood. And yeah, I just wonder,
Yes.
there's all these
Yeah.
interesting parallels. I mean, E.O. Wilson went on about us being like ant monkeys.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
I think there's a
Yeah.
lot
Yeah.
to that idea.
There is Sarah Hardy, who is that in that sort of lineage of E.O. Wilson, sociobiologist. She wrote a book about fatherhood recently. And so, like, the big question about humans is, like, why do the males actually, how are they contributing so much to childcare now relative to like our other primate or even other monkey species where males oftentimes are not involved at all in parenting, are typically like an extreme huge danger to the young because they'll kill young that aren't theirs.
Hmm.
And so the question is this, like, to what extent is this like something that evolved in the human lineage specifically, or is it just like an entirely a cultural adaptation and it's just like we're kind of taking this latent genetic program that is there for women mostly, or was selected for women, and we're just activating this latent genetic program
Hmm.
through the system that works for women, but it just kind of doesn't necessarily work as well for men, but it's still there to be activated in men as long as they're this physically there, close to the infant, interacting with the infant. And
Hmm.
so this is something that she explores in her book. And so one of the things that she does explore, making it relevant to the chemical communication issue, she says they do studies of basically that babies have the smell. If you've
Mm-hmm.
ever smelled
Yeah.
the head of a
Yeah.
baby,
Yeah.
and so this is connected to a particular chemical. I think the abbreviation for it is like hex or hexa or something. And, so they show that, when you're smelling this chemical, it then leads to a oxytocin prolactin response. And they just
Mm-hmm.
show that, the response is there in women, it's stronger, it's faster in women. And then, but it also happens in men. And eventually it does get to the same or similar level to the women. It's a slower ramp up
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in men. So yeah, so this is an example. There is a chemical signaling environment in addition to the other signaling environments that exist for humans. Whether it can be like precisely classified as pheromones or exactly like what the precise classification. It's, we'll leave it to the specific scientists, but
Yeah.
it's certainly there
Well,
to some extent.
to extend that question, is it possible that human microbiomes contribute
Mhm.
to group identity? Can we, like, microbiomes produce volatiles, and
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
wonder if humans actually detect it's kind of like another layer of relatedness that you could potentially communicate through.
Mhm. Mhm. You always hear in these microbiome studies about how, like, when you're living with someone, like the microbiome profiles like begin to converge or match with each other. And there's like differences between like if you're living with an animal or not living with an animal and so on.
Hmm.
But in terms of group identity, I've never really heard or read anything about that. And I'm not sure exactly, how that would work or what exactly that would mean. I guess like how would you like flesh that out more, I guess, because I don't I don't quite understand it. Like what would it mean for group identity? Like I guess like this whole like population is colonized by a specific strain and that
Yeah, or like kin
facilitates
recognition. Like you're more likely to
oh
cooperate with people who smell similar to you, and part of
mm,
that
mm,
signature surely is
mm,
coming from the microbiome. So it
mm,
could be
mm.
like an honest signal of relatedness.
Sure, but due to the fact that many, I mean, so there's many microbiomes depending on like what organ you're talking about. Like, is it
Mm,
skin? Is it gut? And so on. and because they're dynamic to some extent
Yeah,
too,
yeah.
right? So like I said, with the people who live next to each other, if they live or close or in the same house, like their profiles start converging.
Mm,
And so like it just seems like proximity would just immediately solve like the problem.
mm,
So I don't know. I mean, there are that is simplifying it. Of course, there are some host genetic factors too, like but they're not well understood. And
mm.
the big challenge in microbiome research is, of course, like everything study-wise is for the most part observational. And so we can't like establish causal relationships in one direction or another. And so any association that you find, you always have to worry about confounding, for example, but you also don't know, even if the relationship that you found is causal, is it which is causing which,
Yeah,
what
yeah,
direction is it?
yeah.
And so that's the huge thing. And then there's also many technical challenges too in microbiome studies that I think have been in some respects solved better in other subfields of genetics than in microbiome yet.
Mm, mm.
Um, Even like the decision to like choose, like if you're familiar with microbiome, like everything has to do with basically sequencing of a ribosomal gene, right? It's
Hmm.
16S sequencing, and that's the basis of like so much of the microbiome field. And so like, I mean, that itself was like a choice, you're only looking at the microbial diversity only through this single gene, right? So it's like tough. Now people like have extended this and so on, but like in terms of like really making it like a field where like we're really finding like this microbiome is definitively doing this and we can intervene and fix this because of that. We're like kind of like in the beginning stages of
Yeah,
of getting somewhere with microbiome and metagenomics, unfortunately. But
yeah.
it's very flashy and gets a lot of news. Yeah. So and then the one application is like the fecal microbiome transfer for treating C. difficile. But
Mm,
that's like extremely uh, it's kind of like a risky procedure too, I guess, because they've had some times where the C. difficile infection I think gets worse after the transplantation. So,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it's been such a small number of people that I think they've done that for too. But it's certainly an emerging frontier, and I have a Substack friend who is an active participant in microbiome research. His research is mostly related to cancer microbiomes and whether
Hmm.
cancer microbiomes modulate responses to immune therapies. Immune therapies have been a Nobel Prize winning breakthrough in the treatment of cancer, and you know, what's not necessarily understood there is why some people respond so well to these immunotherapy drugs like pembrolizumab or trade name Keytruda, and why some people don't respond. We have some ideas, but there's a lot unknown there too. And so
Mm.
some people propose microbiome is tuning the immune system and changing how people respond. And there's some, you know, uh, hints that that may be the case.
Mm. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about biology. I want to
Yeah.
spend a little bit of
Yeah.
time talking about literature because, like I said,
Yes,
you're all across the board. And
indeed.
I've dabbled like I read widely too. I've even
Mhm.
dabbled with writing some like long form fiction, and I'm
Nice.
starting to. This is my thesis basically that if you look back at like the history of the literary arts, poetry went from a relatively respected art form that was a small number of people producing it and a large number of people appreciating it. But then towards
Mhm.
the end of the 19th century, with mass literacy and paper and education, suddenly
Mhm.
everyone was trying to like write their own poetry. And most of it
Yeah.
was pretty awful. And it kind of poisoned the whole art form. Like the whole
Mhm.
idea of poetry to date, most people think it's a bit cringe. Like it's lost its
Mhm. Mhm.
cultural cachet because you're just
Mhm.
as likely to think about someone's embarrassing, not very good poetry versus like Keats or someone who like achieved the heights. And I wonder if
Mhm.
the same is happening with novels now that we
Mhm.
have ebooks and self-publishing and this huge
Mhm.
flood of people having a go at writing a novel that
Mhm.
it's almost like you're sitting down to a feast and there's just so much bad food in the kitchen that you have to dig through it to find
Yeah.
something that's actually tasty. That the
Yes.
whole idea
Yeah.
of eating it all, like you lose your appetite. So yeah, do you have any thoughts about like how that whole cultural ecosystem is evolving?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's something I think about regularly. Um, people have been debating like, is the novel dead for like decades and decades and decades? And, it still is held on to some degree of relevance among, some set of people. It's always like to like, what is the amount of people, what is the amount of the readership or audience that matters, and like, how important does it have to be like important in the culture, or is it enough just to have like a few thousand or a few hundred thousand people, or maybe a few million people that care about these things.
And well, it's
And so
telling that a
yeah,
successful novel is one that gets turned into a movie. That's kind
yeah,
of like
yeah,
the
yeah,
the highest
the
thing you can
standard.
aim for as a novel writer.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, and certainly, I mean, it depends on too, like, are you looking at it from a like a economic or financial perspective too? Like, if you define the success of literature as something that is being sold to millions and millions of people and is being read by millions and millions of people, if that's the success point, is definition of success, then I think we still have some of those events happening, but is that like quality literature? A lot of the times the answer is like no, like
It's quality marketing.
yeah, like Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey are some of like the highest selling books, and like I think 50 Shades of Grey started as like a self-publishing thing, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, it's like it's like, pulpy sort of things can, go absolutely viral and sell out, and that's not necessarily a measure of quality. But in terms of like, is it basically the quantity of noise uh devaluing the medium itself or the art form itself? And I would look at it as in a different way. I think it does create a problem for prospective readers, or even just educating people into, because like to have an appreciation of art, to have an aesthetic sense, or to be a tastemaker or an expert in something, like you need to be trained, you need to be acculturated into it. And so there has to be someone who's participating in that process or doing that process. And so in in America, where like it's public education, like the only exposure you have is like whatever is assigned on your syllabus in your English courses, and that's what you're taught. And it's like a limited amount for the most part. Like if people are interested in readers, there's kind of like it's a bifurcated population. There's like basically 50% don't read, and then 50% read. And of the 50% that read, like probably a lot of them are just reading trash. That's probably like a small percentage of people that are actually like reading true literature, however we want to define that. And the extent is like who is going to influence like what those people reading like actual literature are, or looking for actual literature, what they actually pick up. And I think we just need better curators
I
and
was going to
better
bring up
public
that word.
intellectuals.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Curation seems to be the limiting step because
Yeah.
undoubtedly, among the flood of self-published novels, there are amazing things, but unless they're also really good at marketing, they often
Yes.
just like get lost in the wash. Like if a book doesn't get noticed within the first few couple of months of it coming out, it's pretty much dead. Um,
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's a hits business. And so, I'm sure there's probably some really great literature that's just sitting on the scrap heap and was never noticed by anyone too. And like so even great works can go unnoticed. That was I think like one of the famous examples was like the novel Stoner by, I don't even remember the author's name, or like Williams or something. And I picked up the novel. It's a really excellent novel, but he was like an English professor at some like small college, and he wrote this one novel that's an extremely well done novel, but it like had kind of languished for a while, and then was like picked up because someone found it and someone like pushed for it and so on.
mm.
And so to some extent, like the success or non-success of a work of art oftentimes depends on like the distribution mechanisms and the people that are involved in promoting it. I mean, I think there's a famous story involved with like impressionist paintings too. There was like this one guy in Paris who was like buying all the impressionist work, and he's the one who is like going there and popularizing all of it, right?
Mm.
Or it's like even with the theory of evolution, like or like scientific credit, for example, a lot of times it's determined by some of these dynamics. Like who's Darwin's bulldog is like, was it Thomas Huxley or one of the Huxleys? He's like responsible for like really pushing Darwin into the social consciousness, for example. So basically, how we understand a lot of these cultural totems, cultural artifacts is governed by things beyond the object itself. And so we do need better public intellectuals. Like, could you name, for example, like a public intellectual who's notable specifically in like the humanities or like like philosophy sort of space? Like, who would you come up with if asked?
Who's currently active.
Yeah, currently active,
I'm
not like in the
I'm
past.
and
Yeah.
yeah, I'm really ashamed to admit it would be somebody who's cracked the YouTube algorithm like Jordan Peterson. And it's like they're the only
Yeah.
people who
Yeah.
make it to the top of that viral pile.
Yeah. 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 That's what I say. I would say like the person who fits that mold that comes to mind is like Jordan Peterson and maybe
Is he the 50 Shades of Grey of philosophy?
I mean, he's certainly like a popularizer of mostly Jungian, like it's like a Joseph Campbell sort of version of philosophy. It's a mixture of like the Jungian archetypes and the like evolutionary psychology, and that's his bit. And like it could have been, it was very successful for a period of time and a very brief period. And but the problem was it was like intimately tied up with like political and religious valence in a lot of ways. And like, so he was never going to be like a figure for everyone,
Hmm.
right? And so because
But you
that
almost
wasn't the
need to be
case,
polarizing to win the
yes,
virality
no,
game. Otherwise, you've got no
exactly.
hope. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's exactly the challenge. Yeah, we don't have like the Harold Bloom or the Lionel Trilling or the Camille Paglia, which I mean, some of them can be like polarizing too. Although I feel like it's more so like when looking back, we start to polarize. The polarization is like a later phenomenon.
yeah,
Like
it's
it's layered onto
retrospective.
them. Yeah. But I can't think of like who would be that today. There's no one with a similar profile.
Yeah, yeah.
No.
Do you think that AI could get really good at curating human created art and maybe filtering out AI art too,
Mhm, mhm,
before it actually gets good enough to like write a whole novel on its own? Like that seems like a much easier problem to solve, and it's a more relevant
mhm,
problem. We don't need
mhm,
more novels. We need a way of managing, the million that come out every year.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think both. I would say that I think we do need people still creating literature if we want that form to survive, if we want to find a new pathway for literature. I think the last time I saw this, like really being active, in my personal view, was like in the 90s. And I really center this around this figure, he's kind of like a meme himself, and and the kind of a secular saint, David Foster Wallace. And
Mm,
he was like someone who was trying to wrestle with the challenges posed to literature by modern forms of entertainment like television, and then also a lot of the ideas that emerged from or in response to postmodernism and post-structuralism and so on. And so that was like a really active thing. And the response, which was also partly connected to like Richard Rorty too, which is like this meta modernism, or Wallace is more associated with this new sincerity where he's like trying to like basically like we need to get past irony that's like destroying meaning and the TV, it's like to me in some ways it's kind of this like old man sort of conservative perspective is like it's rotting your minds. It's like kind of inside of that perspective to some degree, but that was his like kind of way of fighting with these ideas. And like, what is that today? There's like different things happening, but like I think we still need something new. But back to your point about, using AI to be the curator for us, like that is like the Netflix algorithm, right? But like
yeah.
how good is if you're a user of Netflix, how good do you think Netflix suggestions are for you?
And what
Yeah.
counts as an optimum? Like, are you looking
Yeah.
for highest engagement? I can't put this down even though it's crap. Or are
Yes.
you looking for the most transformative literary experiences that actually mean something to you?
Right, right. Because based on revealed preferences, they know this is like there's like the aspirational things that people put on their watch list, and then the things that they actually watch.
Mm,
And it's the same thing for reading as well. So like women are like there may be women out there. This is not that we mean or target women anyways. It's easy to know about women's reading habits more so than men because
mm,
women tend to read more than men.
mm.
And then it's like they are putting like Jane Austen or Middlemarch, George Eliot on their to read list, but then they're reading like A Court of Rose and Thorns or
Yeah.
whatever the latest like romantasy viral book is. And so like that's a kind of a fight. It's like people just want to be entertained a lot of the times when they're picking up a media they don't necessarily want to be challenged. And not everyone, always going to be like a there's something elitist specifically about like developing an aesthetic sense and training yourself to do that, and then try and appreciating art that fits that mold. So
Mm.
it's kind of like the you know Pinker's famous for like saying that all these like great artistic works is kind of like evolutionary cheesecake, right?
Yeah.
So like in order to appreciate the evolutionary cheesecake, you have to have like really worked to get there, and not that most people are not going to be dedicating their lives to doing that sort of thing.
I would bring up the example of the Venus of Willendorf. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
hubba hubba, look at you. Like that obviously was an art form that caught people's attention from like, the dawn of history.
Mhm.
A
Mhm.
related question. Do you think the internet is worse than television for culture?
I think, well, I don't, it's like hard to like worsen in what way. Like, I think to some degree, like it does destroy like a monoculture,
Mm,
right? Because everybody can self-sort into whatever their specific community is. They like, this specific type of Japanese manga, or they like this, like they like Victorian novels, or they like these type of crime procedurals. And each community that's specifically into that can sort into those spots. And that can be like really generative and enjoyable for the people who are like extremely into those things. But then overall, there's like no shared community.
yeah.
Whereas before internet, before like mass proliferation of like printing, or I mean, even in that time where there was more gatekeeping and more like agreement on what the culture was, like you had like a specific set of cultural texts,
Yeah. Yeah.
like the Western canon as stereotypically described, and people
You
had
could
those.
talk to a random
Yeah,
person on the bus,
yeah,
and there's a good chance you'd have some cultural experiences in common.
yes,
Regardless of
yes,
quality, at least it was shared. I'd
yes,
also point to maybe Game of Thrones was like the
yeah,
last
yes,
coordinated TV event, cultural event,
yeah.
and I don't think there's
Mhm.
anything like that since, and there may never be again.
No, no. Yeah, I mean, there's kind of like echoes or like feeble versions of it that occur over and over again, like, or they only like impact a large segment of a certain type of person, like
Mm.
say like say like an upwardly mobile, like college educated person, you get like the whatever the latest like show, Sunday show on HBO would be, and like White Lotus, for example, and then like everyone on Substack is like talking about that. But then, like if you go ask like your neighbor down the street, they're like, what's that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
on. So that's the experience of the internet. But
It's like it's like a cultural or narrative Tower of Babel. Like
yeah,
we've been split up into a million different stories and aesthetics, rather
yes,
than it being on a language level.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. And like, how bad will it get? Will it get to the point where you can't have functioning democracies? Obviously, there's a lot of like concern about that that floats around out there in public discourse today, and especially because then they're like, oh, people are latching on to like basically entirely fantasy narratives of reality and so on. Not that that's like even entirely new. I mean, go back to like witch burnings and so on, and medieval Europe and like that. But so it's not a new human behavior, but
Mm.
yeah, it's like how extreme will these phenomena become because of the scalability and the speed of the internet? I don't know.
The thing I see coming next, I think I would call it like digital Amish, that the open internet will become so overwhelming and
Mm,
unusable that people will basically circle the wagons and say this is our safe cultural territory where we spend most of our time and energy online, and the rest of it we're just going to mostly turn our back on it.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's happening now. I mean, there's already like a reaction. There's reaction against smartphones themselves.
Hmm.
Even for example, John Haidt is a big public intellectual, leading that charge where he's, get them out of schools, get them at least for children specifically,
Mm.
don't let children on these devices. But then like, how many people do we even know that like actually like are exploring the internet anymore? Like people did back when it was new.
Mm.
Everything's facilitated, guided by apps, and like, how long will we be on the smartphone platform? Will it eventually be like a different platform that things move to? Obviously, they trialed like the metaverse and AI goggles, and I guess those get too hot. I've actually never worn one of those, or no,
The,
don't know what the experience
the
is
the
is like,
motion
but
sickness issues seem to be
yes, that
intractable.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that like doesn't work. And then some people are like saying that, oh, it'll be like a pin that projects out and then you'll interact in the real world. Like, I don't know. I mean, hopefully like we can get to a platform where we can interface with, the World Wide Web, while also like not having to have like our head down in in our palms as well, because it certainly does, has a social cost as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one uh, point of light I think that we've both experienced is Substack as
Yes.
a an alternative. Like it's probably the least. I mean, it's philosophically anti-algorithmically driven, so you can't just like go on a feed and like scroll. You actually kind of have to actively engage and select who
Mhm.
you're going to. Like it's
Mhm.
very old
Mhm.
school in many ways, but
Mhm.
I'm just curious on
Well,
your
so
perspective. Like,
are you an app user though? Sorry,
no,
because
no, I've never put it on my
yeah.
phone. Yeah. Yeah, I use
So
my
yeah,
phone for
well,
podcasts and
uh,
text messages, and that's it.
so that's really hygienic, because the uh the Substack app does actually have an algorithmic feed
Ah.
on Notes. So it already does exist. But I would say that relative to other versions of that, like say, like of course Twitter or X
Mm,
is like, or Blue Sky, some of famous comparators, I would say that the level of conversation and the tenor of the conversation is a lot better here on Substack, because it's still linked to what you were describing, where people have to voluntarily seek out and subscribe to whatever the channel is that they're interested in.
mm, mm,
So yeah, I think I would really love the Substack platform. I wasn't that much of an early adopter. I think I've been here from like since 2021, and I mean there was just like a lot of people I was interested in following and reading there, so I joined, and I like sometimes enjoy writing, and so I got on board too, and I've been here ever since. And I think it's the most interesting and healthy uh, discourse community or content creation community, whatever the proper term for whatever Substack is, and out there. It's really exciting. I think the hurdle is being like is figuring out like where to go from here.
mm,
There's like it's pretty hard to make this sort of thing like turning out like essays or sharing thoughts or just commentary and podcasts like into like a real sort of like activity that's providing people's livelihoods. Like obviously for the most people on Substack, it's not their day job. It's just something that they do as a hobby.
mm,
And so like how much, people have, well, how will they continue to get something out of it? Will they continue want to generate for the platform? And alongside the people who do make a living on Substack, these people who mostly have come on because they already had and built huge followings. The famous examples like, Matt Iglesias and the Free Press and Barry Weiss started there. A lot of them are like big time political journalists who came
mm,
over to Substack, and um, after leaving large mainstream publications, and then they've since continued to have existence there. And so, can this sort of its own community exist alongside that? I don't know. Or how long will it exist for? Well, the kind of the brain rot and the disaster that happens on the wider internet or on other apps come for Substack at some point in time. Almost certainly some of those malign incentives will also appear on Substack, or already have. There's the kind of big blowups about like plagiarism that have occurred recently, and there's blowups about like people using like just AI generated uh like particles entirely. Like I think like with one of the top articles recently was like was or speculated to be like entirely AI generated.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's like, it's like how long will people really be putting their own ideas in this and investing in the platform? I don't know. We'll see. I think
Mm.
it's pretty healthy right now, at least, and it's one of the most exciting things out there. So
The key thing for me is that they give you direct access to your subscriber email list. So if
yes.
the platform becomes corrupted and sold off and unusable, At
Mm,
least in theory, you have a way to continue what you've built. It doesn't get
it's
completely
true.
leveled and you have to start from zero again.
Yes, yeah, that's a really great feature of the platform, as well as like, they keep improving. They really do ship a lot of new features regularly, which is also great. So like there is like a real maintenance for the platform. I'm also like a strong or super user of the Goodreads platform, but that platform is like the opposite thing. It's this like dinosaur user experience, and it's like not it's clunky, it's often slow, and it's hard to navigate around. It's definitely not like a 2020s level app experience where Substack, is continuing. I mean, they in the time since I've used the I mean, I was here before the app. There's the app. The app has been able to handle video and audio, and they keep adding all these different layers to it, and as well as you control so much as
Mm,
a creator on the platform. So yeah, I can't speak highly enough about Substack. So
mm, mm.
many great what I mean, I think like to some extent like I read less and less of the other like mainstream comment like sources of cultural commentary or intellectual writing that exist out there because so much of it exists on Substack now.
Do you think fiction itself is going to make the transition to Substack? I know there's people experimenting with it, but I haven't
Yeah.
seen it quite catch yet.
Yeah, so I think the one big success is the John Pastelli's Major Arcana, where he did serialize the novel on his Substack channel, and then I think it was picked up by a publisher, and it had like its own release and so on, and it's built a readership.
Mm,
So there are some successes. I think right now they would need to develop like an e-reader sort of function
yeah, yeah.
for that to be something that could really start to scale on Substack. Because right now it's like you would just like link the posts of the serial editions, and like
Mm,
it, like the fiction has to be kind of short by its nature because otherwise like the email is going to cut off after a certain length as well. So right now there's some kind of hurdles to like making it a good platform for fiction, but I wouldn't necessarily rule it out entirely. I mean, Charles Dickens was like someone
yeah,
who
yeah.
wrote serialized and was paid by the words to some extent.
Back
That's what
back in the
like Dickens
newspaper,
writes a lot.
everyone would be
Yes.
waiting for the next installment. Yeah,
Yes, yeah,
can be
yeah.
done. I have a theory that, well, I'll ask your question first. If the
Mm,
novel is kind of like well past its peak and facing all
mm,
of this like assaults from different directions,
yes.
what do you think might be the next form of cultural
Mm,
storytelling, of
mm,
delivering and exploring fiction in a way that the
mm, mm.
audiences are ready to engage with?
Yeah. I think I don't think there will be like one dominant medium. We just get a fragmentation and some people will latch on to one or the other. I mean, even in the wake of like the dying novel, the long death of the novel, has been like prestige television, which
Mm,
itself has kind of died off too. I mean, you
mhm,
mentioned not that Game of Thrones was like the highest version of this, but that was, kind of associated with the prestige television rage, but it was mostly like it's kind of like the beginning of it was the high speed. It was the Sopranos and The Wire, and then it was
mhm.
like Breaking Bad, and then like what else was there? There were some other ones, but yeah, it was to a lesser degree. And then we have podcasts. So there are fictionalized podcasts, like for instance, like Serial from Sarah Koenig, which was I believe associated with like public radio in America at some point in time. That was a huge hit. But it's kind of like still like a kind of a true crime thing,
Yeah.
mostly when it was a big hit. So it's like it's kind of a pulpy genre.
Mm,
But so I think all of these will kind of coexist and compete for a while. And I think it'll be whoever can make basically the algorithm's suggestions the most efficient,
mhm.
as well as, um, make their business model work. So many of
Yeah.
the business models seem broken in this area. Like if you listen to like reporting or read reporting on like the, the film studios and so on, like everything is kind of in crisis, and like they're figuring out like how do we get people to come to the movie theaters, or how do we run this subscription-based streaming platform and still and have enough money to create content? How do we make it be profitable? There's all these like big challenges to some of these
Well, I
business
mean, the
models.
the current economic model of the internet is advertising. Like it's the only
Right.
reason it really exists.
Yep.
And I have concerns that if AI becomes powerful enough and personalizable enough, you won't need to browse the internet anymore. You'll just get the AI to find you the information that you want. And the
Yep.
opportunities for slipping advertising into that process are just
Mm,
going to evaporate. I mean, we're
mm.
already kind of seeing this with Google searches, where at the top they'll give you like an AI summary that they've scraped from other people's pages, which I
Yeah.
think is causing all sorts of headaches from people
Yeah.
who rely on people clicking on their pages.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there'll have to be a new economic model, and if that's how it's going to be, I don't know exactly if it'll 100% be that way. I mean, I certainly use the new AI chatbots and the different technologies since the emergence of ChatGPT way differently than I did before, and I still do some like normal like web browsing too, though, but perhaps I'm a bit of a different person too, because I'm looking for actually going to scientific literature too. And a lot of these, you know, uh, like if you actually are going to use like in an unlimited way, you have to definitely pay for a subscription for these AI models if you're going to use them to like help you read a bunch of literature, for example. So otherwise, you have to still do it the old-fashioned way.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, so. I don't know. I mean, there will need to be a different business model, and it may not be advertising it. And obviously, we've been moving to a subscription model. Substack is a subscription based model, and what else can there be? I don't know. Periodically, you'll see people wanting to say like, like we need like sort of a subscription pass or like a bundle or something like this for Substack or like micropayments.
Yeah.
And like there's many objections or like issues with any number of these solutions. But it's true that if the internet's going to be like an generative economic platform, which it has to be for it
Mm.
to continue and to exist, and it already is, and the incentives will be there for that, then we have to find some solutions to some of these issues, and I don't 100% know what they'll be.
I,
Yeah,
I
I
I
think there
wonder
was
if you could ever
even
see
yeah.
something like a UBI linked to value
Mm,
adding to the content on the internet. So you don't have to
mhm,
do all of these
mhm.
little tiny annoying transactions with every person
Yeah,
who happens to
yeah,
look at what you've created. There's like a central government saying, "Yeah, you've made the internet a better place. Here's a way to like continue doing that to support you in that endeavor."
yeah. Then it almost becomes like you have a social credit score that's associated with your like digital profile,
Hmm.
and like you'll be rewarded based on that. And obviously, like everyone, some people think of this as like dystopian, and I mean, it has the potential to be dystopian, it has the potential to work, potentially too, in some respects. So.
Hmm.
I don't know. I mean, it's something that could work. I know they trial, like supposedly in China, they trial something like a social credit score, and it works differently. I don't think they're paying people for like what quality or what value add are they providing on the internet. But I think people should experiment. I mean, I don't
Hmm.
know. Like it would be interesting to see if like Substack would like if you would randomly reward creators who put together a particularly valuable essay. But like
Hmm.
then like how is the value measured? Like I could write like this really amazing 10,000 word piece that's extremely well researched, and it it will have no chance of like going viral.
Yeah.
Whereas like you
Yeah.
could write like a some sort of personal essay that's like particularly juicy, and then like you're getting like thousands and thousands or of likes on, which is a lot for the Substack platform at least. So it's like,
I guess we're
like
kind of
how
already
do you get over
there.
that?
We're kind of already
Yeah.
there because we have corporations paying influencers, like in
Yes.
this
Yeah.
in these kind of gray area, like
Yes.
advertising endorsement kind of relationships. It's not
Yeah.
nobody knows quite what how to classify and regulate those relationships.
Yeah, it's like that's really opaque. Like it's hard to like because you can't like follow the prices, like
Mm,
for like what is a celebrity paid per like sometimes some of this information like leaks out and you hear it and it's like kind of crazy. Like
mm,
someone's being paid like $1 million to by this group to post about this specific thing. Like this
yeah.
single tweet was paid this much. It's like it's hard to know like exactly the nature of that
And it's
economy. I
not
don't know the
new.
details. Maybe someone does.
Like product placement in TV and movies has been going on
Yes.
for decades as
Yeah.
like a under the table
Yeah.
relationship. So yeah, it's not exactly
Yeah.
anything new.
No, no. Yeah, I mean, I think finding more ways to incentivize and turn like behavior we like to see, or especially like things that are improving the quality of discourse, improving the quality of ideas, if those can be made into economically viable processes, I think that'd be a really great find.
Mm,
I think Substack right now is the closest to that. And it's just, it's certainly not like the ideal like some of us would want. The question is like, is there ever, would there ever really be
yeah,
a big
yeah.
demand or, or something that even generalizes like, because even it can be like, it can be workable, but it's only going to work for like the people who are the absolute top of the top percentile of it. And, everyone else, they all the gains go there and they're not distributed in more of a normal fashion.
Mm,
And so that if that is the model, which a lot of the times there's many outcomes that are like that, then it may be hard if you can't break that pattern at all in any way to ever have this utopian vision come true. But
mm, mm. Oh, we should probably wrap things off. This has been an
yeah,
amazing conversation. I'm so glad I got a chance to get you on.
yeah, it was
I
great to talk with
had
you.
I had my doubts because there was so many different things I wanted to talk about. It's like, how
Yeah,
are we going to tie this all together? But it
yeah.
turned out really nicely. But do you just want to remind people where they can find you to read more of your work?
Yes, yeah. I can be found at stetson.substack.com. You can search me on the Substack app at the Substack website at Holodoxa, which is Holodoxa, which is kind of a portmanteau of holo, the Greek prefix, and doxa, the Greek base, I believe. Um,
It's the entire truth.
yeah, basically. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Or like all ideas kind
yeah,
of getting that to like I drew it from like holoenzyme and in biology, with these super complex enzymes.
yeah. No, it's
Yeah.
very well named, and I'll drop that link in the show notes so if people don't
Thanks so
have
much.
a pen and paper handy, that they can find it easily. And yeah, Stetson, thank you very much for what's been a really interesting and multifaceted conversation.
Thanks so much, Shane. It was great to be here with you and we'll connect on Substack some more in the future. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you want to support all the work that I do, you can get a paid subscription to my Substack to access my archive of extensive posts, or just sign up for a free subscription to get a reminder every week when the free email comes out of whatever I've been up to on the farm. You can also grab a copy of Taming the Apocalypse, my exploration of the potential for a post industrial biotechnological civilization. Next week, I'll be talking with Ambling with Sam, a brilliant YouTuber who explores local traditional agriculture in the wilds of Peru, Papua New Guinea, and beyond.